Hi, everyone. It's with great pleasure I welcome you all to Traction Art Talk, the Institute of the Art and Sciences Artist Speaking Series. At the IAS, all of our programming reflects our conviction that the arts offer profound insight into the pressing political, social, and ecological issues of our time. And we cannot be more thrilled that Sharon Hayes is able to join us today to talk about her creative practice, interrogating the intersections between history, politics, and speech within the context of the current political moment. I'm also pleased and grateful that Jennifer González, my comrade and faculty co-director of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences, is going to join Sharon in conversation. Jennifer will introduce Sharon more fully, and I know that Jennifer needs no introduction as a beloved professor in the history of art and visual culture department at UC Santa Cruz and a brilliant theorist and author. So I'll have Jennifer and Sharon join me now, and I'll turn it over to them. Hi, thanks so much for being here today. I look forward
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you for that kind introduction. And welcome, Sharon. And before we get started, I just want to note that the University of California, Santa Cruz is located on the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Ama Mudson tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to the missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. And I also want to note that it is Earth Day, and I want to wish everybody a happy Earth Day, and also to say that it's probably important to keep in mind that every day is Earth Day, and it's a wonderful thing to have Sharon here with us today to think about some critical political frameworks. So let me say, I met Sharon many years ago through the Whitney Independent Study Program, and I have followed her work with much interest. I think she's one of the more compelling artists of her generation. And although I have not written about her work directly, I have really enjoyed seeing it over the years. And I'm going to offer an incredibly short introduction for a very illustrious career so that we can get right to her talk. Throughout her career, Sharon Hayes has consistently explored speech and voice in relation to historical and political events through a lens of queer politics in particular. Her work consistently critiques US militarism, war, and heteropatriarchy in ways that also foregrounds the presence of alternative modalities of enunciation. Born in Baltimore in 1970, she studied anthropology at Bowdoin College in Maine. She was a student in the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York and received a Master of Fine Arts degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. She has been widely exhibited with solo shows at the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Reina Sofia in Madrid. She is the recipient of numerous grants and awards, and I encourage you to check it out if you want to know more about that, and is currently a professor of art at the University of Pennsylvania. So Sharon, I turn it over to you. We'll be first hearing from Sharon, and then I'll be coming back in with some questions and we'll have a conversation after.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Jennifer and I have circulated in the same public events, but never sort of been directly in conversation in public. So I hope that this will be sort of the beginning of more conversations like this. I really appreciate being here. I really appreciate the invitation. So thank you to you and to Rachel, and also in the background to Irene Lustig, who certainly had some influence in getting me here to this spot as well. And yes, I am zooming in from Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral lands of the Lenape, and acknowledge these lands as a gathering place for Lenape, past, present, and future. What I will do, just for everybody who is logged on to the webinar, if you are anything like me, then you're coming to the webinar and perhaps doing at least one other thing, if not 5 or 6 or 10. So I'm going to try to sort of succinctly go through a kind of overview of some of the commitments of my practice, and then I'm going to zero in on two works that Jennifer and I will sort of take up in our conversation in particular, for which I'll show you moving image clips as well. And because some of what I'll do at the very outset is I'll read over top of some images, and because of this multitasking and as well that some of the images include text, I'm going to go through them relatively slowly or quickly, medium amount, just for 2 minutes in silence, and then I'll start them again and I'll speak over them. So now that you've seen them once, if you want to look in a different direction or lie down or take some other sort of physical relationship to the Zoom screen, please do so. I do what I do because what we do is urgent and necessary. By this, I mean my practice acts in collective force and resonance with a field of works, voices, and practices that resist normative behaviors, complicit and unjust social agreements, and prescriptive temporalities to open up new ways of being together in the world. I use video, performance, sound, public sculpture to expose specific intersections between history, politics, and speech, to unspool reductive historical narratives, and to reignite dormant pathways through which counter-understandings of the contemporary political condition can be formed. I'm motivated to a deep study of the grammar, linguistic, affective, and sonic, through which political resistance is manifest. These examinations are central to my work, from the earliest video installation in 2013, the Symbionese Liberation Army, Screeds 13, 16, 20, and 29, in which I re-speak each of the 4 audio tapes made by Patty Hearst and the SLA during her kidnapping, to my most recent video work, Ricerche 2, which is one of what will become 5 videos that examine how gender, sex, sexuality are deployed in the current political crisis in the United States. The deepest motivations for my work come from some of my earliest experiences, the profound convergences that animated my arrival in New York City in 1991 into a decidedly political, feminist, and queer performance world congregating in the East Village in the midst of the AIDS crisis. Urgency and immediacy were the atmospheric conditions of that time and that place. In short time, I came out as a dyke, an artist, and a feminist. These coming outs were personal and emotional, but they were also political. They were most dramatically and dynamically about my relationship to other people, to lovers, to a scene, to a collective, to a moment, to the necessity to speak and act and move together toward radical political, personal, and aesthetic transformation. In the decades that have followed, I have come to see political crisis or see political crises unfold as persistent conditions, perpetuated by those invested in sustaining and maintaining political power. Nonetheless, as I have grown as an artist and as a person, I find myself more, not less, reliant on collective action and collective activity. From these foundations, my work sustains a distinct and vital commitment to performance and to collaboration. I'm devoted to the radical possibilities of non-normative occupation of public space, and am invested in holding public space as a site for unpredictable and unregulated encounters. I believe that the forms of communication that we use to address each other shape what it is that can be said, and as such, I'm deeply invested in creating new forms in which and from which to speak, in which and from which to listen, and in which and from which to act publicly. So, to lay some of the groundwork for our conversation tonight, I want to elaborate a little bit on a series of videos that I've been making under the series title Ricerche. Ricerche is Italian for research, and it comes from this film, a 1963 Pier Paolo Pasolini film called Commisi d'amore, or translated into English generally as Love Meetings. And this film serves as a kind of structural ghost for the video series Ricerche. Pasolini's work, which was shot in 1963, released theatrically in 1964, was made in direct conversation with a short line of European cinematic works in a newly inhabited genre known as cinema verite. Birthed from the collaboration between French filmmaker and ethnographer Jean Rouch and French sociologist Edgar Morin, cinema verite literally translates to truth in cinema. While cinema verite has come to be used as a general or generic description by many for documentary cinema as a kind of genre, Rouch and Morin were more interested in the pointedly production of reality or of truth that the camera did. So a camera that did not just capture, but actually made possible a given reality or a given truth. Indeed, those public inquiries that Rouch Morin made in their 1960 film Chronique duette, that Chris Marker followed in 1962 in his film La Jolie Mai, and that then Pasolini stepped into in 63 with Commisi d'amore, were only possible because of technical advances in film and sound technology, which allowed for this lighter camera, which could then be transported to the street or to the site of publicity or publicness, as well as synchronized sound, thus enabling this form of speaking, or maybe we could say speaking and answering, possible. This is Pasolini's description of the action or behavior of the film, Commisi d'amore, via intertitles that he uses near, an intertitle that he uses near the beginning of the film. The translation goes over 4 stills, so. Sorry, so I'll read it out loud. In which a kind of traveling salesman is seen going around sounding out the Italians on their sexual preferences, and not to launch a product, but to understand and report faithfully. What interests me about Pasolini's film is not the commitment to cinema verite, which he actually kind of productively or provocatively undermines throughout the film, but it's the dogged pursuit of what Pasolini calls the sexual problem. In Commisi d'amore, it's Pasolini himself, a gay writer, a poet, a film director, a communist, who goes on to the streets and into the countrysides of Italy to interview people about sex, sexuality, love, as well as about homosexuality, perversion or inversion. He sometimes uses those interchangeably. Pasolini's interviews probe the ways in which sex and sexuality act out symptomatically in so-called value-based policy and ideology, and in adopted and pervasive norms that cover up underlying economic and political vulnerabilities, something that we also consistently see in an American political context as well. In the film, Pasolini almost always interviews people outside, a choice which was largely practical because it kept the costs of production down. But he also, therefore, is interviewing people in groups, in social, familial, or occupational groups, family groups, groups of colleagues or friends, army buddies, football teams, co-workers, neighbors. It's this choice to interview people in groups which was most interesting to me and which really, I think, sort of provoked me to launch into this series, Ricerche. The interviews ask the interviewees to answer seemingly personal or intimate questions as their social selves, or themselves inside of their collective affiliations. And so throughout the film, there's this tension, or one could say maybe an even unsettling or a indeterminacy between the collective and the individual, between the we and the I. In my work, Ricerche, I use Pasolini's Commisi di Amore as a kind of structural visual map. Sometimes I also think of it as a kind of ghost, visiting some of the kind of places, in quotes I could say, places he went and following the impulses of some of his argumentation, but not replicating his path. I've made 3 semi-autonomous works in, as I say, what will be a 5-work series. And it's the first one was made in 2013, and the most recent one was shot and premiered in 2020. The 3 autonomous works are Ricerche 3, which is the earliest one, made in 2013, which is an expanded, or I could say even an intentionally exaggerated in terms of scale, interview with 35 students at Mount Holyoke College, an all-women's college in Western Massachusetts. Ricerche 1, which was shot in 2015 but edited and completed in 2019, a kind of delay I can talk about a little bit. It's meaningful and meaningless in certain ways, but and Ricerche 1 is a 2-channel piece composed of interviews with kids of queer and trans families. There are 2 groups of interviewees in the piece, existing sort of in this 2-channel monitor, back-to-back monitor piece. The first are 5 to 8-year-olds, and then the second group is a single group of maybe 14, 17 to 18-year-olds with the sprinkling in of a 27-year-old and a 31-year-old. And then the newest work, Ricerche 2, which was shot in February 2020, and just therefore before the pandemic lockdown, a miracle that I am constantly grateful for. And I finished and premiered in September 2020. It just recently showed in Los Angeles at Christina Kite Gallery, a collaboration with Christina Kite and Tanya Layton Gallery, and this image is from there. And this is an expanded interview with 23 members of 2 women's tackle football teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So team members from a team called the Arlington Impact and another team called the Dallas Elite Mustangs. So Chloe is now going to show us 2 clips, and they'll just go back to back. The first one is 4 minutes, and the second one is 6 minutes. The first one will be from Ricerche 3, which is the extended interview with students at Mount Holyoke College, and then it'll be followed by a 6-minute clip from the most recent work, Ricerche 2. So I will stop sharing and let Chloe pick it up.
Feel like you can, do you feel like you have the same kind of sex or a different kind of sex than your mother?
What?
What do you think?
No, seriously, what?
Do you feel like you have access to being a different kind of sexual person than your mother was able to be?
I mean, like, sort of, not really. I don't know. My mom went to a co-ed school, so she had, like, and I've never asked her if she had, like, experiences with women. So I don't really necessarily feel like I could have, like, different sex from her. I feel like I could have, like, maybe, I don't know, like, maybe some different, like, relationships or just, like, different experiences, because, like, everyone's different in that way.
What about you?
Different sex than my mom. Yeah, she got married when she was 16, so I guess she didn't have time to experiment. I still think she's gay because she's had the same short haircut for the longest time, but that's just a stereotype. But yeah, no, I think I definitely did, especially growing up in a different country and just, I don't know, more open-minded and more open to trying things.
So how many genders do you find on campus?
I think it's tough to quantify them because, I mean, something that we say here a lot is just that you should never put things in a box. So, I mean, somebody could be more masculine of center or feminine of center or somewhere in between or on the extremes. I don't think you can actually label it and quantify it, so I wouldn't know how to tell you.
Do you label yourself?
Yeah, I actually identify as a more masculine of center person. I use male pronouns, and I guess sometimes I use the term trans man, but that's just, for conversational purposes.
Did that happen here?
Well, it was always kind of like a tomboy thing in the past, and then here I found the vocabulary and the discourses to kind of justify it to myself and to other people. But my parents don't know, so it's just here that I exist as he.
How does that schism happen, the kind of being here and then not being here?
Well, it's kind of weird in my head, whenever I leave this campus, because when I take classes at UMass, I'm she, and that's Paula, but I'm still the same person. I think I just feel more comfortable here among my friends and my networks, and then when I exit this space, it's different, and it's the real world, and I have to face that people aren't going to understand.
Do you feel like you can be as free as a man?
I actually think that me as a person, I would be freer than a man, because I feel like men are more pressured into fitting into a certain kind of like boundaries of like masculinity, whereas women are like, I don't know, it's easier to be freer in terms of sexuality for a woman. I'm not sure why, but that's just
You're nodding?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I know a couple of trans women who have just had a really hard time transitioning, because I feel like if you're previously or born, your sex is a man, but your gender is a woman, there's this thing about society that just sees that as so wrong, because if you're a woman with a penis, that's completely uncalled for, but if you're a man with a vagina, it's not that it's more acceptable, but it's people just like, oh, all right, we'll look over that. But I think it's definitely like when you're a man, your ability to self-identify is really difficult in the world, because men are held to a certain standard, I think, and it's an inappropriate standard.
How does that function for you? You identify as trans man?
Yeah, I identify as male. I don't know how that really fits in for me. My family kind of sees it as like a phase. It's not something that's, really, they don't believe that I'm actually going to follow through with. And I feel like that's part of it. Like when your sex is female and your gender is male, people kind of look over it and they're just like, oh, it's either not a serious thing, it's a phase, or you're just a butch lesbian and you'll come to it. So I feel like it's invalidating, people telling me that I'm not what I think I am, because I've experienced that my entire life.
The next play.
It is painful pleasure, but honestly, when we out there on the field and it's game time, you don't feel no pain. You don't feel anything.
It's not till the next day. You wake up, you have like contusions, you have bruises. You're like, did I get hit by a Mack truck? Even being on defense, like I have hit people hard, and you hit them and you roll with them sometimes. I mean, it's not just necessarily you laying a hit and then you don't feel anything, but the adrenaline is so high, that run, that you stop them. You put them on their back. You good. The next day, I don't know.
On my back, like,
Yeah, like,
wait.
I need a chiropractor. I need to be oiled like the Tin Man. I'm broken. Yeah.
How long you been playing?
Football, women's football.
Tackle football.
I was started in '99, so about 7 years old. So I'm 26 now.
You do the math.
You do the math. Somewhere in there, it's been a long time. So I started out playing with guys growing up, middle school, high school, and then DZ found me, and I've been with Impact for 4 years now.
So were you the only girl playing in those leagues?
I was. I never played with any other girl.
And why do you play tackle football?
To spite my parents. No, like I always played with the boys in elementary before it was organized, and then in middle school when I wanted to play, they wouldn't sign a waiver. So I stumbled across this. Just one of my friends is a photographer. He shot the team, and then it turns out one of our OC. I did his boot camp, so I knew them, and I was like, well, I'm just gonna show up and see what I got, and that's how I got started.
How do your parents feel about you playing now?
They think it's great. I think it's pretty awesome.
How long you been playing?
This will be my 10th season.
Are you the longest vet on the team?
I believe so, yes.
What made you start to play tackle?
I just like the camaraderie, everyone coming together. I've always wanted to play, and I thought it was a man's sport. So just the fact that there was a women's football team that I could be a part of, I was really proud and excited to come out there and work.
What do you mean when you say you thought it was a man's sport?
Just growing up, you're told that you can't play. That's a guy's thing to do. Women can't do that. You're not supposed to do that. So, it's something that you just kind of stray away from. But when I found that there was a women's football team, I had to go out and see what it was about.
Does playing football make you feel different about being a woman?
We are different. I don't feel any less of a woman. In fact, it makes me feel more of a woman because I can do everything that men can do in pads and not, in the lingerie. A lot of people think that whenever they come out that it's going to be lingerie, and when they see us in pads, they're like, oh crap, like these girls are serious, like these girls are not playing. So it definitely makes us feel more of a woman, if you ask me.
What is lingerie? What is that?
Little panties.
Right, it's little panties that are real cute, and it's supposed to be all fun and whatever, but it's the total opposite of this. I tell people all the time, like, I promise you don't want to see some of my teammates in lingerie.
It just seems like they're just sex objects. Because a lot of the guys are there and they just looking at them, drooling everywhere. But
sex sells. We understand that, but like if you score a touchdown and then reach up in the crowd and chug a thing of beer, like really.
Does football make you a better lover?
I don't know how to answer that. Maybe, yeah.
Let's hear from you.
I think yes. I think yes in a way because it teaches you to be more open. Like obviously other people aren't the same as me, but I have a boyfriend, and he gets questions all the time where they're like, your girlfriend plays football, like lingerie football? And they're like dapping him up, and he's like, no, like pads, helmet, like full pads, everything. And they kind of give him the side eye, like, why are you with her?
And
like,
have you had people who haven't wanted to go on a date because you play football?
Yeah. I've had guys like not talk to me because they're intimidated.
Wait, tell me about it.
I said I'm the opposite. You get a lot of play because you play football. So that's a whole different. I didn't even think about that. I didn't even think I'm sorry for that, Because I'm serious. It's like the complete opposite for me. Like it's like, what, you play football? Dang, that's deep.
Explain the opposite.
I mean,
why do you get play and she doesn't?
Well, first of all, let me say I don't have to deal with men. I don't have to worry about that situation. I'm on the female side, so I feel like it's attractive. You got muscles involved, and if you're good, you're scoring touchdowns. Everybody want to talk to the to the superstar. So it makes for an attractive situation, and the women come.
The women want to talk to the superstar.
They want to talk, yeah.
That's your experience also?
My girlfriend's on the team. She's a safety, and so she's defense, I'm offense, but I mean, we play together. We obviously keep everything off the field, but I mean, outside of practice, outside of games, we're still playing football together. This is what we do. It's kind of part of our relationship.
It's kind of tough. It could definitely be challenging because we put so much of our extra time into this, and it can definitely take away from what you're trying to build with somebody else. So there comes sometimes a sense of neglect or not spending enough time. But I mean, we put a lot of extra, like we all have full-time jobs, and this is another full-time job that we have to fit into our lives. So sometimes relationships, they can be really challenging, especially sometimes it can be jealousy. You know, I'm around all these women all the time. We hang out off the field. So jealousy sometimes takes a role, and it can be challenging. But if you have, you know, a woman or a man that trusts you, then, you know, then maybe it'll be easier than some of the experiences that I've had. But
Do you think football makes you a better lover?
Um, I don't think football makes me a better lover, because outside of football, I do a lot of loving, and you know, football doesn't play a part in that. You make time for what you want to make time for, you know. So even if you're spending 100% on the field, and you spend, you know, 100% at the job, you know, you still got to go home and, you know, work your magic, you know. So
So that
So I seem to have a bit of a glitch in my connection. Hoping it's going to come back shortly. Hi, am I back?
I'm back. I think
Okay,
we're
you were
back.
okay. I don't know which one was gone. Was it you? In any
it was-
case, okay. All right, great. Good. Thanks for showing your work. Did you want to continue, or should we start our conversation? How are you feeling?
No, I think so.
Okay, great. Well, I'm sorry that you're breaking up a little bit. Let's hope that you can stay with us. And I wanted to just think a little bit about your works. I wonder if we could go back to one of the earlier slides that you showed from a piece called In the Near Future, where you're showing some protest signs. We could pick one of those slides and just bring it back up for folks. And then we'll come back to the research pieces, which are so wonderful.
We can go here.
Yeah, it could be We Are Innocent or Ratified. That's great. So if we go back to this early piece, which was called In the Near Future, which was a series of events where you used protest signs from actual historical live protests and brought the signs back in to play decades later with the same typography, the same look as the original, which took a certain amount of research going back and pulling these signs from the past. I wonder if you can say, would you talk a little bit about this work first, and then we'll move to Ricerche. So from your early work, such as In the Near Future, to more recent works, there's an explicit effort to develop a critical engagement with an economically, or rather from a historical standpoint, from a question of the kind of, let's call it the folding of history. So in this case, history, memory, testimony, and protest are central to these carefully crafted and thoughtfully edited events that you create, whether these moments of silent speech, as it were, holding these signs, or films. And I wonder if you can say more about why, in relationship to these works, you use the term re-speaking, and that will lead us up to the Ricerche, as opposed to reenactment or performance. I find that to be really interesting in your work. What does the important folding of time in these works mean? So maybe we can start there.
Yeah, great question. And please let me know, I guess, in whatever way possible, if I stutter or if it breaks up and I can move. I think that you're right to point that I try to be very specific and rigorous about the language that I use to name what I'm doing. That doesn't mean that I can control that, of course. And so reenactment kind of swirls in the background of much of my work or my use of material or documents or texts or speakings from a past moment. For me, one of the things that's problematic about reenactment in terms of how it circulates in the world is that it tends to regard history as recoverable or whole to a certain extent. A reenactment tends to suggest that we can put the pieces back together in this different time and place and show, quote unquote, what it was like. I'm much more interested in the ways in which the present moment is proliferated, where there's a proliferating sense of past moments and future moments. And it's not that they're all there, but that they align very often the certain past moments, what I can say are near past moments, create certain opportunities for me to kind of enter into the this very, very full present moment. So in part, in the near future, the kind of foundational question for me, which was a research question in a sense, but it's research through embodiment or through praxis, was how does the speech act of protest make meaning? So I did go through all sorts of processes of culling, doing kind of what we think of as research, looking at photographs, reading things, gathering as much as I could from various, from a whole multiplicity of past moments of protest, which is super instructive. But then I was also, it wasn't really until I took any number of these signs out onto the street in 2005, 6, 7, 8, because the piece was made across 4 years, that I understood this triangulation that takes place with the speech act, so that the meaning is constructed in this triangulation between the body that holds the sign, the words on the sign, and the place and time in which they're held. And as you disturb one of those things, the protest sign itself sort of changes its address. It gets sort of thrown out of immediacy and into something that I think of as a kind of indirect. So re-speaking comes up. It was really a term that I first used when doing the SLA work, the work with re-speaking Patty Hearst's the audio tapes of Patty Hearst speaking to her parents. But it became a way for me to think about inhabiting a voice that is not my own, such that I'm not claiming it as my own, and yet I'm working with myself as a kind of medium or a channel, because I'm interested in creating the address again. I'm interested in what happens if this thing that is out of place. I sometimes also think of in the near future as very actively using a strategy of anachronism, and anachronism in its literalness of a mistake in time. So that something is wrong, and that wrong, the error, allows us to see something that we can't see so clearly in protest itself. Okay, anecdotally, like with this sign, which is "We are innocent" is a quotation from Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, which was used in protests against the execution of the Rosenbergs in 1953. And I'm holding it in Times Square in 2005. And I got up there at around 8 a.m. and I came with the pole and with the sign. And as I was taping the sign to the pole, there was someone who was waiting for his buddy to drive around, like a parking thing. They were selling baseball caps on the up at Times Square, and he was waiting for his buddy before he could kind of lay out the caps. And he watched me do that, and he was like, "Oh, that's cool." And then I was standing out there for about 20 minutes, and he came over to me and he was like, man, you need a new sign. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, I don't know, you should have something more direct, like fuck Bush or something. So I think that there's a way that the the double take or the non-address that we are innocent is making an address to another public at a different moment in time, but resonates against this kind of shimmer of iterative ways that bodies take to the streets to to resist injustice and violence.
And it's also when you fold time that way, it's a reminder of those events that are unsatisfactorily resolved, right? So ratify the ERA now is a wonderful example of that, which is something that still hasn't happened. So this kind of way in which history is holding possibility for us still is another part of the series that I think is very beautiful, or the fact that you borrow from the sanitation workers strike, the I am a man sign, excuse me. I don't think you have a slide of that today, but there's a wonderful tension there between sort of a cross-racial identification and a cross-gender identification that is about sort of, again, the glitch that you're talking about in the location where you are and the sign that you're holding, and that sort of kind of semiotic disturbance that invites really different kind of response from a different audience. So I wanted to.
Yeah, and maybe I can add that disturbance is, I started to think of myself as a kind of placeholder. And I began this work at a moment when there was a real depression that I think many of us felt about taking to the streets. It was 2005. We had this experience in George W. Bush's early term of taking to the streets in 2003 to protest the war in Iraq, which of course then proceeded despite massive bodies on the streets, or massive volume of bodies on the streets. And so I did, again, as an artist, not as an activist, like to step into this work was to say that there was something important that I was trying to understand, not from the middle of the protest, but from some kind of in-between place. So this placeholding also means that the sort of semiotic disturbance, I'm not a master of it. I'm an agent that is sitting inside of it. And so to the I am a man, to the point of I am a man, all of these works function as anachronism or error or citation. But of course, with a sign so deeply important to a whole past, present, and future of the fight for Black lives, the fight for racial justice, the fight for civil rights, and its continuities, that also can be an act of appropriation. And so that slogan has proliferated so strongly in the Black Lives Matter movement and has had really deep and important reassertions held by Black bodies, which is part of why I don't actually show the image anymore, is because I think in the context of the full piece, which is a slide installation where all of these things are in conversation, I am a man is in this conversation, which circulates also around questions of 1968. But when it circulates, when that image, because it became quite popular and circulated often as a kind of iconic image of this work, I decided to pull it from sort of where I can, I pull it from permission. I do disallow permission for publication. Because it ended up doing something that actually the piece is working against. The piece has, I don't know, 356 images that are constantly moving in the space, and excess of images of these actions. But that ended up becoming a kind of singular stand-in for a whole that misrepresented the work.
Can I follow up on that though? Because one of the things that I wanted to say is that from your very early work, such as In the Near Future, to more recent works, there's an explicit effort to develop a critical engagement with economically and ethnically and racially diverse groups of subjects. And in some cases, there seems to be an explicit identification on your part with racially specific protest histories, such as that one. And I just wondered if you could say more about these decisions on your part. Like, how do you feel your work engages explicitly with racism in the US? Because I think that it does. And I think it's smart and intentional about trying to do that. What if you just want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, what I kind of went through maybe in my beginning laying out was that there was something kind of I came to my political subjectivity and my generational specificity. I really have come to learn in my early 20s when I landed into New York in the middle of the AIDS crisis. And I think that that was a really profound sort of coming to consciousness. So to come out as a dyke and a artist and a feminist at the same time inside of the AIDS crisis, and to be held by, maybe I can call it an atmosphere in which the intersectionality of sort of oppressive, the intersectionality of violence and oppression against these multiplicities of conditions, factors, identities, identifications was constantly sort of at play. So that time period is not so, that time period is not so unlike ours, and yet there are vast differences, of course, but some of the forces of, very reductively positioned as culture war tend to create, from a sort of massively invested and supported contingent of right-wing ideological positions and sort of institutions, there is a kind of attempt to put down a whole section of intersecting sort of desires for intersecting desires for transformation. And so maybe what I can also say very simply is that if in my own political consciousness I'm moving through queerness to understand who am I in the world and what is the political world about, when I go through queerness, I immediately get to this deep and long struggle for Black lives and civil rights. And so just prior to, for instance, the homophile movement, and deeply, I think the homophile movement was in, so the homophile movement being some of the beginnings of a kind of 20th century gay, queer, what became gay, queer politics, was really impacted upon by the Black left. And the kind of commitment from the homophile movement to publish, to narrate, to rip and like extract the narration of queer life from the sort of pathological discourse of psychiatry was directly informed by and inspired by and fed by the deep publishing efforts of the Black left and a whole set of forces. So I guess as I look through queerness, it is always and already intersecting and full of intersecting identities, not only in terms of political tactics, methodologies, and movements, but of course also in terms of embodiments and positionalities.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I wanted to come back to the Recherche series, and your own body is minimally present in the frame of the camera. We see a profile, the back of your head, your outstretched arm. And this definitely echoes the visibility of the interviewer in Pasolini's Commisi d'Amore that you talked about, which I really was pleased you were able to bring some slides in from that. And I kind of wanted to think about how your films, such as your films interviewing the children, it's really lovely. So I encourage folks to see these works, explicitly begin with the kinds of questions, in fact, the exact same questions Pasolini asks, but then they become shaped by the answers you receive and the subjects you choose to interview. So I wonder if you can speak a bit about how your video series begins with, but then peels away from Pasolini's film, and why this is significant, maybe both in terms of historical moment or the subjects that are being interviewed, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, from a compositional point of view, I did actually mimic Pasolini in the sense that a single interviewer shot largely over, yes, either my right or my left shoulder, kind of groups of roughly sort of 5 to 8. And that kind of choreography of shot composition over the camera was quite intentional. What I was interested in, there was to kind of hold and to allow to put into operation this tension that I was talking about, or maybe indeterminacy between the I and the we. And so in the scope of my large, like too large, no one should interview 35 people at a time. It doesn't make any sense. But the too large interview becomes something where there's never in the piece, for instance, an establishing shot. I sometimes publish those in literature about the work, but you never see the full group in the video itself. The other found sort of, as you point to, the other sort of way in which the ghost of the film arises is in my borrowing of some Pasolini questions. What I was interested in, I didn't exactly know what that would do or how it would function. I let all of the interviewees know beforehand that I was informed by this film. I didn't show it to them in its entirety because I didn't want them to be super self-conscious, but I showed them clips of it. I told them it was kind of driving my interests. I said I might ask some questions that Pasolini asks. The thing that's helpful about asking the questions from Pasolini is they're not questions I would ever ask, does marriage solve sexual problems? Like, I would never ask that question. But in the context of this interview with these, in this case, the Mount Holyoke students, these 20-somethings, it was really helpful to me to disturb a kind of documentary authenticity, and also to allow for our conversation to sort of situate itself or operate in unstable time. So what was interesting to me about posing this question like that one, does marriage solve sexual problems, to these 20-somethings, is they actually tended to answer it without missing a beat. Or, do you think of yourself as a Don Juan? They just, love that. Yeah, which they correct me on my pronunciation. But they just answer it. And that also became kind of fascinating because it felt like we could have a sense of what was important to me to destabilize documentary was to allow for a sense of the kind of singularity of the conversation, that the conversation need not represent or be representative, but rather it's coming a little bit more from the operations of performance, that it is something that unfolds in time, it happens as an event, and then it's done, except that the recording apparatus allows it to go again and again and again. But I think even though I'm not performing in this work in the same way I do in my other works, I think of the kind of structuring of the work itself, or the structuring of the interview, being more along the terms of performance than along the terms of documentary.
Mm-hmm. And the kind of re-engaging with these questions that were post-war questions of 1960s Italy, that we don't necessarily think of as timely, and yet they're very beautifully answered and very poetically engaged by the students, and also by the young people in a way that I found incredibly moving. And I also loved when the question, do you consider yourself a Don Juan, was posed to a trans man and also to women, female identified women, and just trying to think again about sort of the way that the language itself is in its repetition in a new place, and really makes a difference there. How are we doing? I feel like I lost my connection there briefly. We're okay?
I heard.
Okay, good.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Let me go to my next question. We're going to open it up to group questions too shortly. So your method is grounded in a number of intellectual and artistic formations, including conceptual art and feminist art. I wonder if you can say more about how you see your work in dialogue with these traditions and how these traditions continue to structure your approach to newer projects. So anything you want to say about that sort of engagement with your work?
And so wait, can you repeat the construction part?
Yeah, I just said that your method is grounded in a number of intellectual and artistic formations, including conceptual art and feminist art.
Mhm.
And I just want to know if you would like to say more about how your work is in conversation with these traditions.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think a lot about genealogies, and I'm interested in genealogies, and I feel in active relationship with maybe multiple genealogies, and um, and one of the things that's interesting about that for me is because I started really in downtown dance theater and performance in New York. Um, and I started making work in the early 90s at a moment where there was a real sort of investment inside of that scene. I could call it like the one woman show, but there was a real, I had such a sort of privileged and pleasurable sort of learning process of going to 4 and 5 and 6 different events a week and watching performers who were maybe 5, 6, 9 years older than I was, but really enunciate and elaborate like a new political sort of landscape, and B, a new sort of landscape of gender, or like kind of to see in a way what was possible inside of aesthetic practice, in terms of the production of what I can call politics, or the production of what I could call political possibilities. So in some ways, my formative learning exposures, genealogies are there in what is also a little bit of a mess, because things don't necessarily come to, kind of club state, to the stage of the club or the stage of the like alternative performance space in kind of neat discursive categories, in the way that then when I got to the Whitney program, I was able to kind of like parse out and like say, oh, okay, this is the genealogy of this discourse and this is the genealogy of that discourse. When it comes up in downtown dance theater and performance, it's just like a kind of pile of effective and ecstatic expression, which is awesome. It's awesome that happened. So then when I was able to kind of myself maybe step out and look at, with both growing older and having more time to study or more time to read, then I started to understand the relationship that scene has in a larger field of performance genealogies, and also the ways in which, yeah, as you're saying, conceptual sort of genealogies or feminist genealogies both kind of touch each other and depart. So that's a long way of saying that I do feel incredibly informed by kind of fed by, taught by a number of really important both theoretical and spaces of theoretical discourse and also spaces of praxis. And I would probably say that the dominant sort of emotional ones are feminist. The conceptual trajectory I deeply appreciate, but it is not as it doesn't kind of touch the forms of my sort of love or devotion in quite the way that the feminist genealogies do. So I also had a really foundationally important relationship that started at the Whitney program that extended out of that into UCLA with Mary Kelly as a teacher. And so in that sense, that's a moment where those things, where I could really hold and learn from her directly and also from her practice, the important pressure of feminist praxis on conceptual praxis. So yes is the answer.
So
do you want me to say more about that or say?
No, you don't have to. I mean, if there are any, I was thinking about the audience maybe being curious about what kind of feminist artists in particular, Mary Kelly being one of them. It's really wonderful to name and to give a shout out to, because she's influenced both of us, and she was also my teacher. So it's lovely to see how her legacy plays out in different ways, and that we're both here having this conversation. Was sort of thinking, were there specific artists you were inspired by in either tradition, or if there was some more of that story you wanted to tell. But I'm also happy to ask sort of my final question before we open it up to conversation with the audience, because they'd like to ask some questions. So why don't I go ahead and do that? So one of the questions I'm really interested in is around the question of speech. So the idea of speech or voice. So speech, private speech, public speech, political speech is presented in your works as an important condition for the process of subjectification, the making of human subjects. Power, in the kind of Foucauldian sense, underlies these social relations of speaking. I wonder if you can say more about how you think about power and hegemony when you design your projects. What is your kind of conscious thinking about it in relationship to questions of speech? And there are a few works that you didn't show today that are about, especially women speaking, their voices being characterized in certain ways by newspapers or other kinds of publication sources that attribute qualities to female voices. Or, for example, another work that you did where women are shown speaking, but we can't hear their voices. And so there's a sort of tension around the possibility of the spoken word or spoken expression, particularly for women in our culture today. So I wonder if you want to think through this question of power, hegemony, and speech, and then bring it back to how you're working with that in relationship to women.
Yeah, well, maybe this goes to some of the earlier question of you wondering if I could call out influence. I can say that perhaps the most foundational, influential text for me, a text I encountered, I guess, in my 20s, is Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? And I always fantasized about, like, to unspool history, or in my sense, what I sometimes say, to open a dormant pathway. Like, what if queer studies, if Can the Subaltern Speak was the foundational text for queer studies? Which is not to say that I don't also love Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, but the fixation in the early sort of development of queer studies on visibility seemed to me to really foreclose really important questions about the register of intelligibility vis-a-vis speech and speaking, and a speaking subject. And as you point out, the kind of the institutional and relational structures of power that that regulate bodies in speech, or bodies or speaking bodies, which is also to say bodies in the other space of the encounter, which is listening bodies. So I think, again, like in a way for me, it was a process of learning something really quickly on stage. So on stage, in my early 20s at Wow Cafe, this lesbian, experimental theater space, like from the stage realizing that I was, that I had claimed a kind of site of attention, that I had claimed a kind of duration of address, that I had a kind of power to enunciate at that moment with an audience, and to have to kind of reconcile that and navigate that and negotiate it, and also negotiate what it meant for who I was interpolated as, like what I became in that site. So much of the early work that I did, I began by saying, hi, I'm Sharon Hayes, which was always a kind of like, I'm Sharon Hayes in brackets. I'm Sharon Hayes from this position of a kind of extraordinary moment that is held by these institutional kind of frameworks that we're inside of. So in some ways, that early encounter with that institutional frame, then as I had more time to read and think and study and be in conversation with people, I was able to go sort of towards a richer or more complex understanding of it. And this question of, okay, so I guess to be, to be transparent, if we're talking about something like Rancière's idea of like the aesthetics of politics being about what is intelligible, what can be heard, my interest in Spivak was this foundational elaboration, really, a kind of mapping that she provides around political subjectivity and aesthetics, and the questions of what, which I guess is also to say that therefore an opening for art. Like that is an opening for the space of art, that we as artists, we as people who care about art and think about art and write about art, have something to say about these structures of regulation, these structures of conscription in some ways, or silencing or amplifying, that are so impactful, and also obviously extremely dynamic and fluid. They're never the same. So our Twitter verse, or the Twitterverse, has shown us that, now we're talking not about sort of publicness necessarily, but of publicity, power through this kind of incredible amplification of what is said, or what someone has the kind of empowered capacities to say.
Well, it's a wonderful question to raise in terms of the work that you do, what the role of the internet might be in resituating the speaking subject, and trying to think through the question of that kind of power relation. What is the platform that's available? And in one of Oliver Ressler's films, he interviews a man who's living in Russia, and who says, people may have the freedom to speak, but they don't have the freedom to be heard. And your work makes me think a lot about that question, which is, in a democracy, you have to not only be able to speak, but to be heard.
Right.
And the question is, how do the current internet platforms preclude certain people from being heard still, even when we have access to all of these possible platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram? Theoretically, anybody who has something to say can be heard, but there's a cacophony. So in the context of a cacophony, how do you have a democracy? So I think,
well, I would say there's a cacophony and a like a door that has blown open to enable and sort of let pass the violent putting down of speech. So we've certainly found that with any number of, with Black Lives Matter, with
yes.
YouTube, with gaming gate, or the kind of calling out of masculinist patriarchal gaming culture. So that open door to violence, the violence of and injury of words, but also the capacity of these words to provoke and inspire physical violence is really disturbing, and something obviously that we're all contending with actively every day, every minute, every moment.
And we also benefit from the possibility of sharing on that space. So I think that there's a lot of potential there. I don't think that we only can dwell on the difficult parts. You say, we are able to do so much more organizing and work in that speech environment. But it's interesting to try to think about what is free speech online, and how do we really understand what speech in the spoken is in a democratic context under these kind of multiplying conditions of retweeting and commenting and so forth. It's a very big question. It's a long question. We don't have to answer it now, in fact. But I was just thinking that I think some of your work really provokes these questions, and the internet allows us to have access to different historical materials in a way that we might not have just a few generations ago, to produce those kinds of historical collapses that your work addresses, to bring those different moments together, like in the same temporality. So I think it's pretty exciting. All right, I want to open up to folks in the audience, and we have some questions in the chat. And so we have a question from Michael Becker, which is, I'm curious about the relationships you develop with the communities you work with. On a more logistical or mechanical level, how do these relationships develop, and do they continue after the instance of the artwork itself?
It's a great question, Michael. I do think of all of my work as being intensely collaborative. When I am working with other people, like in the Ricerche works, and when I am not. And I think those relationships are, in that way, they're, they are the sort of DNA of the work. And so, but what you're talking about, both in terms of maintenance of those relationships, is really critical and really important. And also this question of how I begin those relationships. It happens differently in each work, and I try to be very specific and conscious about what structures I use to invite people into the work. So sometimes, for instance, so in a work where I was asking people to read out loud texts from lesbian feminist, proto-trans newsletters from 1955 to 1977, I didn't need actors. I needed readers, but I did use a casting call because it felt like I could, in that sense, I could call out for a community of identification that I was interested in, tell people about the project, and that a kind of acting casting call offers a kind of like the beginnings of a kind of contractual relationship also, where I can say, I'm going to pay you for this contribution, and this is how your contribution happens. And then I do try to let those readers know when that piece shows again. In the case of Ricerche, I have used both a kind of organizing strategy of like inviting with the kids, with the 5 to 8-year-old kids. Obviously I had to work with parents, which is a whole different matter. And those kids are now, let's see, 11, 12, 13. So in some ways I'm waiting for them to get to be 18 when I can have a real conversation of about consent, because their parents consent to their participation, but they have not, in fact, actually consent. The 17 and 18-year-olds did, but not the 5 to 8-year-olds. So I try to stay in contact. I am sometimes good and sometimes bad about that, just because it's like all email maintenance. But it is a really important part of the piece and of all of the work. And you're, yeah, I really appreciate you bringing it up. I think in each of the cases, I've tried to bring the work back to the site that I made it so that the people I work with can see it. In the case of the football teams in Dallas, I haven't gone back to Dallas because of the pandemic. I hope to in the future, but in the meantime, I send them the cut, I send them the edit, and I let them know when it's showing and kind of try to keep them up to date on how their, you know, how their interview and how their participation is circulating and traveling.
Great. Let's see, we have another question from Willow. It says, you identify as a dyke, as someone who grew up and came out in a time when people called us bull dykes and bull daggers in a hostile, disparaging way. And then we took it on as a strong identity. I called myself a young dykeling. Could you discuss your view of what you mean by being a dyke?
Willow, yes, yes. I used to, when I first came out, I don't think I used this myself, but I know that I heard older lesbians and dykes calling me and a small group of us like baby dykes. You know, it's interesting because I came out in 1991, I guess, and I didn't come out as a lesbian, which later I made work, and I use the word lesbian, and I perhaps use dyke less and less, but I have, even maybe over the last 5 years, tried to really acknowledge what it meant and what that was about in the early 90s, coming out as a dyke. I mean, I'm not sure exactly your age and how we line up, but it may be that you charted that path for me to come out as a dyke. Dyke felt edgier. It felt more my community. It felt more it felt more descriptive of the kind of the kind of clothes I wanted to wear, the kind of people I wanted to date, the kind of community I wanted to sort of become into than lesbian did. And I think these words are really, for me, they're so fascinating. I could kind of talk for, I wish everybody, like we could all get together and talk about them, you know, for weeks on end, because none of them are stable, because they change dynamically over the course of, you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, definitely. And they change in really complex ways. So this piece I was talking about with the newsletters from 1955 to 1977 was a piece where I went, it was a revelation for me too, to re-examine the homophile moment, or the Daughters of Bilitis, or early queer activism, not as being not yet ready to be radical, but to understand the radicality of kind of wrenching queer lives out of psychiatric, sort of the psychiatric hold, and self-narrating, and beginning a kind of process of putting names to self-identification. And that it wasn't like that there was a name that everybody agreed upon and then it got critiqued. Of course, it was totally messy, as you say, like many of the terms had been incredibly harmful and injurious, and then was a process of taking them over. So I love hanging on to and feel very rooted in kind of coming out as a dyke. It's not something, I don't think I have, maybe in 8 years, said to somebody, "Oh, I'm a dyke," but it doesn't mean it wasn't, you know, maybe the foundational sort of piece of my queer identity.
Thank you.
I'd love, see, this is where
Great question. I love these questions.
Off Zoom,
exactly.
Then I could ask you things back, Willow. But thank you for your question. At the very least, I can say thank you for your question.
I'm looking at the time. I think this will have to be our last question. This is from William. And the question is, in Chris Cohen's book, Never Alone Except for Now, your work, quote, "I march in the freedom parade, but as long as I love you, I'll never be free," unquote, is discussed at length as something that breaks the barriers of normal social reciprocation and standards. I've been loving looking into the piece and was curious how you, as the creator and performer, viewed its purpose in the frame of social practices and traditional roles, and how you embrace these, refute these standards, embrace these / refute these standards in your own life.
Okay, now because I just scrolled down to the Q&A, but hold on, William, for 1 second. So Willow, now I see these awesome, okay, now I see you're 70 and that you were in the Speakers Bureau of the DOB. So, well then get my email from one of these folks and email me. I'd love to talk more about that. Oh, fantastic. Okay, so William, I do know Chris Cohen and I do know that work and that, yeah, I love that moment with people who write about my work. I'm incredibly fortunate to have this experience of someone writing about my work where I get to see it sort of from a different perspective, or I get to see it anew. So I'm not sure I can fully hold sort of where you are with it, because if you moved from Chris's chapter into the work, I may not be able to kind of step exactly where you are, but for me, those works which I call love addresses, there's 3 of them technically, although there's a few more that I did. One was called Everything Else Has Failed, Don't You Think It's Time for Love? The second one was I March in the Parade of Liberty, but as long as I love you, I'm not free, that you're talking about. And the third was Revolutionary Love, I Am Your Worst Enemy, I Am Your Best Fantasy. And that was a collective action. The other 2 were me standing on the street speaking a love address. And those pieces, they're very connected to In the Near Future in a way, in that they were born of this moment during the George W. Bush years where it felt like in some ways, those pieces for me are about war. So yes, I did absolutely feel that I was occupying a space of non-normative behavior. Like you're not, you're supposed to go onto the street and speak some kind of political missive or address. You're not supposed to go onto the street to speak a love letter. What I was interested in about that was this way that I both was doing and not doing what I appeared to be doing. I was doing public speech. I was standing in the street, in the case of I March, with a bullhorn, in the earlier piece with a microphone and a small amplifier. So I was publicly speaking, and yet because the addressee was my lover or a fictional lover, it was also a kind of destabilized place, and I could maybe say in this way that I was indirectly speaking to the public that was there to witness me, or sometimes not witness me. Sometimes I was speaking to sort of no one. So the thing that was really important about that for me, again, is that there was something that these works, I feel so grateful for them in some ways. I didn't really know what I was doing when I sort of launched into this project. I had written these love addresses. I wrote them by reading. I would read love addresses in kind of 19th century, like queer, as much as I could find, love relationships that were fractured by war. And I would read and read and read and then write. And so it kind of allowing this channel, like my voice and their voice and citation and expression. And I was interested in exploring a place in publicness that was not about power, but was about defeat and deflation and sorrow and longing and loss and patheticness and all of the things about the ways in which we desire that actually keep us moving. They are like something that holds us to our will to survive, and yet they feel so terrible, which is how I felt during the George W. Bush years. And so I'm not sure if I'm exactly answering your question, but yes, in many, many ways, I was aware of the sort of non-normative occupation of public space, and I pushed at it I did, the one thing I did make a conscious decision about was to butch myself up a little bit so that the question of love and how love sat would be sitting with queerness, or at least wouldn't be totally eclipsed by sort of heteronormative desire. But then I think a lot happened on the street, like to learn what that really meant, to do that. In the case of I March, I ended up performing the piece over, it was over maybe 8 days, but in a month-long period, I think I spoke for 6 hours or something. But in these it was one 10-minute love address, sort of repeated again and again and again from different street corners. So it became I think it became a much more complex, which is maybe what Chris was able to see from the outside, a kind of complex rendering of that non-normativity. But from the outset, there I kind of was stepping into it in these two primary ways. One was to hold open queerness as the kind of mobilizing desire, and the other was to do a personal public address, like to speak to a public indirectly through the personal. I hope that was helpful.
I really love that about that particular piece, that idea of the kind of collapsing of intimacy into public space and drawing people in who are walking by in gentle entreaty, talking about, why don't you answer my letters, or why don't you call me? And how that ends up ultimately, when you stay with the piece, you begin to recognize that it's a kind of love address to the government or to power structures or hegemony. And no matter what the mode of address, marching in the street, or even these kind of love entreaties are not being satisfied by a reply, not being satisfied by a kind of political transformation, right? And I love that about that piece. It's really beautiful. It's beautiful. I think we're out of time. I want to thank Sharon for being with us. I want to thank our audience for being here. It's a tough time of the quarter. It's midterms for a lot of folks. I'm really happy you were able to come out and share our time with Sharon. I encourage you to look at her work more deeply when you have time. And I want to thank Sharon for giving us your time and your intelligence and your wonderful work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. What a pleasure to be held by your intelligence and depth. So thank you. And thanks, everybody.
And we'll say goodnight.
Okay.